The time for silence is over.
Without any evidence to support it.
There is not a scintilla of evidence that this is true.
I have not seen the proof.
Have we seen proof of voter fraud at this point?
I have not seen the proof.
Have you seen any evidence of fraud occurring in your state?
Without any evidence to support it.
I have not seen the proof.
The ballots are out of control.
I have not seen the proof.
The only way we're going to lose this election is if the election is rigged. Remember that.
Get rid of the ballots. There won't be a transfer, frankly. There'll be a continuation.
Remember that.
Get rid of the ballots.
Remember that.
Get rid of the ballots.
Remember that.
Get rid of the ballots.
Will you commit to making sure that there is a peaceful transferal of power after the election?
Well, we're going to have to see what happens. You know that I've been complaining very strongly about the ballots, and the ballots are a disaster.
There is not a scintilla of evidence that this is true.
I have not seen the proof.
Get rid of the ballots. Get rid of the ballots. Get rid of the ballots.
You'll never know who the winner is, but the winner's going to be me. Do you commit to making sure that there's a peaceful transferal of power?
We want to have get rid of the ballots, and you'll have a very we'll have a very peaceful. There won't be a transfer, frankly. There'll be a continuation.
You'll never know who the winner is, but the winner's going to be me. It'll be the greatest rigged election in history. It'll be the greatest fraud ever perpetrated.
Get rid of the ballots. Get rid of the ballots. Get rid of the ballots. There won't be a transfer, frankly. There'll be a continuation.
Join me every Sunday afternoon for a new show where common citizens, you and I together, discuss with each other issues of today, where we demand proof and evidence is required, where we seek the truth and will not be silent. Join me this coming Sunday afternoon and take part in America's oldest and most honored tradition. Hello and welcome to The Left Speaks. My name is Chris. I'll be your host today. Today is Sunday, November the 8th, 5 days after the election. It appears that Joe Biden has secured victory and that Trump is left raging about mail-in ballots. The beginning and the end of that trailer have existed since the beginning of this show, well before Trump started railing about this. I make it very clear that this show demands proof, that you have to provide evidence for your claims. The X-Files theme seems highly relevant here. Nobody is worried about aliens influencing our election because there's no evidence of that. There's no proof. There's nothing that's been provided to cause me to be concerned about that. I can find plenty of interviews with people who claim that they were abducted by aliens. Plenty of interviews of people on TV, on the news, saying that they were abducted by aliens. But this is not something that we run around freaking out about as a nation. It's not something where we're putting alien watch patrols on every corner and locking down our democracy to defend against. The reason's very simple. The people saying it don't have any evidence. They don't provide any proof. They just keep saying it. This is going to be a fun show for me because how often in politics do you get to talk about alien abductions? But when the stories are the same and the evidence is the same, there's a problem. As you saw in the introduction video, the evidence of mail-in voter fraud historically is at 0.00001%. So why the sudden concern? As you saw in the video, polling prior to the election showed that Democrats were going to be voting 60% plus by mail. Republicans were going to be at 30% Trump even specifically told his supporters not to vote by mail and to vote in person. If I get to toss out all the ballots that disagree with me, I can win any election you put me in. If I get to toss out all the votes that aren't for me personally, Chris, I could be president this election. We wouldn't really be a democracy anymore, but I could be the president. If Kanye West, who was on some states' ballots, got to toss out all the votes that weren't for him, all the votes for Donald Trump, yeah, those are fake. And all the votes for Joe Biden, yeah, those are fake. We would have President Kanye West, but we wouldn't be a democracy anymore. Part of what is not fun about living in a democracy, part of what sucks about living in a democracy is you don't always get your way. That includes me, and that includes my conservative viewers. But that doesn't mean you get to toss out ballots. That doesn't mean you get to get rid of the entire electoral process just so you can get your way. Because then, when the government disagrees with you, when you decide you don't like what President Trump is doing, when you decide you don't like what President Biden is doing, you don't have a voice anymore. You have no input into the political process. That's why we are a democracy. Governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed. That's me paraphrasing the Declaration of Independence. It is one of our founding, if not the founding document in our nation's history. And to pretend that now, because it's not going the way that you want, that you get to toss that out, you're betraying this country. Now, I'm not speaking to all conservatives. As you saw, that was the Republican governor of Pennsylvania who flat out came and said there's no evidence of this. And I know plenty of Republicans personally who, while they're pissed about the way the election went and frustrated and mad and upset that they lost, they're not trying to undermine the entire American democracy, the entire process that this country has functioned on for over 200 years. I'm talking specifically to the people who are promoting this conspiracy theory that somehow the Democrats, while being incredibly incompetent and unable to accomplish anything, managed to pull off a multi-state conspiracy across the country in multiple different time zones, all through the mail, and rig an entire election so that their presidential candidate would win. Mind you somehow that while pulling off this masterful conspiracy that we don't have any evidence of, while pulling this off, they somehow managed to forget that they needed to also do it in Kentucky so that they could get rid of the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell. They also forgot to do it in the states where they lost House seats. And somehow, even though they could pull off this masterful conspiracy, they could only manage to squeak by couldn't quite pull off Texas. Somehow they only managed to pull this off in cities and states where there was a large urban population, which votes primarily Democrat, and will tell you that when you poll them, and a decent-sized minority population, which votes primarily Democrat, and will tell you that when you poll them. But I guess that they just forgot about, Louisville, Kentucky, and Houston, Texas, and Dallas, Texas, and Austin, Texas, and all these other cities across the country. They were content to leave the Senate, for now, in Republican hands. Even though there was this masterful conspiracy that netted them the presidential election, they somehow forgot about the Senate and the House. The problem here is believing things without evidence. If there's instances of voter fraud, by all means prosecute the hell out of it. I want the system as secure as it can get without taking away the right of American citizens to vote. Because every American citizen of legal age has a say in how this country runs. That's how our country was set up. But if you want me to start throwing out the voices of those citizens, you're going to need some damn good evidence why I should. And it can't just be because one guy says so. And it can't just be because I found one instance of an error over here. If you're going to ask me, someone who signed up and swore an oath to protect and defend this Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, so many years ago, if you're going to ask me to violate that, you're going to need more than some guy getting on TV when he's losing saying that the election isn't valid. That's not the mark of an American politician. That's the mark of a two-bit dictator in some banana republic somewhere. You don't quit counting votes just because you're ahead. Just like football games don't stop in the third quarter just because your home team is winning, you still have to play out the rest of the game, and the rest of the points after the third quarter still count. The same thing is true in elections. If you have proof, actual tangible evidence, not some random guy saying so, but proof, evidence, then I'm all ears. But I have seen absolutely nothing so far, and the stuff that has been provided to me is laughably hilarious and doesn't count as evidence. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. This was from one of my conservative friends that I got in a disagreement with about this whole subject to begin with this week after the election. This is the proof.
This is Mongolia, and we are not them.
Well, not Mongolia.
The only...
We were issued a directive this morning to collect any ballots we find in mailboxes, collection boxes, just outgoing mail in general, separate them at the end of the day so that they could hand stamp them with the previous day's date. Today is November 4th, for clarification.
So 8 p.m. election day, November 3rd. The Court of Appeals ruled ballots have to be received by that time. And what were you told?
To separate them today so they could mark them with yesterday's date and send them through the express system to wherever they needed to go.
This appears to be an attempt to circumvent Michigan law and allow late votes. And you said there was a hamper where letter carriers were supposed to leave their ballots. Where are the ballots now?
They were putting them into express bags to go to the distribution center. In regards to a hamper, there was a standard hamper that all letter mail was supposed to go to, and they had a tub next to it that we were supposed to put any ballots collected today into.
Now, we haven't been able to independently verify.
That's another guy saying something you already agree with. There's no video evidence in that of all these supposed mail-in ballots that he, post-dated to show that they were going to be counted in this election. None of that. Just some guy who's too scared to show his actual face or put his name on it because it's bullshit, saying that, oh yeah, there's a bunch of mail-in fraud. That's not evidence, guys. I can go find a guy on a street corner that probably has schizophrenia that says that the election isn't good because aliens use their mind control device to influence the way Americans voted. So nothing should count because nobody wore their tinfoil when they went to go vote. Just because that guy says it doesn't make it true either. But this is what you sound like right now. If I can destroy your entire case, your entire argument by saying, show me the evidence, and you go, oh, shit, I knew we forgot something, then you don't have a case. It's that simple. To take a charge to court, you have to provide evidence. It has to go through a grand jury. And the prosecutor has to say, here's all the evidence and here's all the witnesses we have that say that Jim murdered Joe. And if he doesn't have evidence, it gets tossed out and it never goes to trial. And then before it goes to trial, Jim's defense attorney gets to go to the prosecutor and say, hey, give me all your evidence so I can look it over. The prosecutor doesn't get to go, no, it's mine and you can't see it. This is why Trump's cases keep getting thrown out of court, because there's no evidence. And he's not providing any. And like I said, you don't get to go, no. You don't get to see it, it's mine. And have anybody believe you. If your neighbor came to you and said, I was abducted by aliens last night, would you believe him? I might believe that he had a weird experience. I might believe that he'd been, doing something that might have influenced the way he thought. But I'm not going to suddenly start believing in an alien abduction. I might ask him what his evidence is for this. Like, did they leave something I can look at? Do you have surgical scars on your body that no doctors can explain? Is there some metal implanted in your body that the doctor can go take out, and it's got a technology that we've never seen before, made from metals that aren't native to Earth? All those things that count as evidence. But I know my neighbor. I know he's an honest guy. But I'm still not just going to take his word on something like that. And neither are you. You don't know Trump personally. I doubt I have Steve Bannon in my chat. I doubt I have Ivanka Trump in my chat. So you don't know Donald Trump personally. All of the evidence, all of it, from nonpartisan sources, from journalistic sources, from this country and from other countries like the BBC, so from the United Kingdom, all of the evidence shows voter fraud rates below 0.0009% is the highest number I've managed to find. So nowhere close enough to influence an election, certainly not in multiple states across the entire country. And the guy claiming that this is going on is providing no evidence of it. None. Zero. Oh, he keeps saying there's evidence, but he won't show it to you. And he won't show it to me. Why do you think that is? I mean, to me, it's pretty obvious because it's total bullshit. Let's look at another interview from YouTube that you probably won't believe either.
Sign. When he says the extraterrestrial happened.
It was so bright it was blinding, and these lights was coming from inside a crowd. And then before we knew it, we both stood up and was already turned around and looking. It was three, I can't say where they was from or what they were, but it was like a robotic creature because they moved mechanically. And they got to us. Two of them got a hold of Charlie, one got a hold of myself. The very minute that they grabbed me, I felt an injection in my arm. They lifted us and took us aboard this female-looking creature. She came out. Now, she had regular facial features, ears and eyes, nose. The only difference I seen in her than what we would, and if you think about it, look at your hands, these two fingers right here are longer, and they was just a little bit longer than ours on her. And she took this right hand and she run it up down the back of my throat. Well, I started choking.
He said the beings who took him made it known they did not mean any harm.
I told you this was going to be a fun episode. But my question is very simple. What is the difference between that video and the first video showing election fraud? Showing election fraud. What's the difference? Okay. One's talking about election fraud, one's talking about aliens. Okay, cool. So the subject matter is different. They both claim to have details. They both got very specific in how this was done. They both told stories that are wildly unbelievable. Stuff you don't see every day. But what's the difference? I'll tell you the difference. The alien guy would at least come out and put his face to it and put his name on it. The Project Veritas guy that was claiming that there was mail-in voter fraud, he wouldn't do that. Now, in fairness, the alien guy was actually on the news, because I don't consider Project Veritas to be anything resembling news. But what's the difference? I don't see one. I see two people claiming to have experienced something or seen something that doesn't happen every day. And both of them providing no evidence that this thing that they claim to have saw and experienced actually happened. And this is my problem with so many conservative beliefs. This is my problem. And I'll limit it to this one thing right now. But this is why I quit calling myself a conservative and basically no longer hold very many conservative values. There's no evidence supporting them. There's no evidence supporting this. So why should I believe it? Why should I believe Donald Trump any more than the guy on the corner claiming alien mind control influenced the election? Or that, there was an entire population of Bigfoot-like creatures that mailed in votes. And they all voted Democrat. Sasquatch came through for the blue, baby. I mean, come on, guys. I shouldn't be able to destroy the entire argument of the head of the Republican political party by asking for evidence. I simply shouldn't. And you shouldn't be behind the guy. To my conservative viewers that still are, again, I know it's not all of you. Some of you are reasonable. But how the hell do you justify being behind a president who doesn't want to count votes? I mean, just for whatever reason. If you want to claim they're illegal votes, I mean, just show me they're illegal. This isn't that hard. Now, I've touched on this one before too, but in full fairness, when I asked for proof of mail-in voter fraud prior to the election, once early voting had started, this was one of the things I came across. It's from PJ Media, a source I've never heard of, but okay, cool. It's from September 24th. I've covered it multiple times on this show because nothing else has been provided to me that I can actually source. No links or anything else. Saying that military ballots were found in the trash in Pennsylvania and most of them were for President Trump. And as you can see on this photo, which is the leading photo it shows when you share it on social media, you look like you got dozens to a couple hundred ballots there. This would be a problem. This would be something I would seriously want to look into. Okay? This is in Luzerne County, and forgive me if I mispronounce that, Pennsylvania. So obviously a battleground state. It was reported on September the 21st. This article is dated September the 24th. So within 3 days, FBI had already shown up working with the Pennsylvania State Police. All of this was over 9 ballots. And I'm fine with it. 9 ballots, guys. 9 ballots and the FBI shows up. You can murder your neighbor who thinks he was abducted by aliens and the FBI doesn't show up. But if you try to vote for a couple of guys in your neighborhood, they will. So explain to me how this wasn't being taken seriously. Now, I've heard another claim. That I haven't remotely been able to source from some random friend of mine on Facebook that was claiming that a 117-year-old man supposedly voted in the state of Michigan and he died a few years ago. Okay, if we can actually prove that, investigate that vote. I'm all down. Not a problem. But I can't find any source that actually says that. I can't find any news media that actually says that. I can't find any pictures of the ballot or anything else. Guys, I'm trying. I really am. In good faith to consider your argument and your position here. But from what I'm looking at, the evidence, there isn't any evidence of widespread voter fraud. Trump keeps claiming he's got it, but you can't see it because it's his. You're just supposed to believe him. And the only evidence I can find is 9 ballots where the FBI shows up within 3 days. Again, that doesn't happen if you murder your alien-believing neighbor. So if you want me to consider throwing out the entire democratic process, the fact that presidential elections are constitutionally mandated, you're going to need to bring a whole lot more. Hell, you're going to need to bring something. Until you have proof that is greater than the proof for alien abductions in this country, I can't take you seriously. When I look at the historical data, and you are more likely to have the guy next to you get struck by lightning on his way to the polls than you are to have that person commit voter fraud. And I see you screaming about voter fraud, but I don't see you screaming about lightning strikes influencing the election against President Trump and demanding that lightning rods be put all over the country so that Trump could win, because he only lost because so many of his supporters got struck by lightning. I don't believe you. I think you are such a staunch Republican that you are putting party over country. And in this country, we are Americans before we are Democrats and before we are Republicans. We're going to take a brief break. When we come back, we'll talk about what's going to happen next in this country. Thank you for joining me. Welcome back. So, what do I think Democratic priorities should be in this nation? The number one, most important thing to me is to undo a lot of the voter suppression things that Republicans have done. We need to make voting easier. You shouldn't have to stand in line for 8 hours in Georgia to cast a vote. That's ridiculous. During the middle of a global pandemic, when we knew more people were going to vote by mail than had ever voted before, with the exception of maybe World War II, when the vast majority of the male population of this country was deployed overseas. Yeah, vote by mail is not a new thing, guys. But President Trump appointing a postmaster general of the United States Postal Service who went on to dismantle mail sorting machines across the country in major cities because they might vote Democrat. Oh, wait, he didn't say that part. But to try to slow down ballots getting in. The massive purge and constant purge of voter rights or voter registrations in red states. We need to pass a new Voting Rights Act. We need to explain to the American people, even though it should need no explanation, why it is important and why it is crucial to our democracy that the citizens of this country actually get to participate in it. We need to explain, even though we shouldn't need to, that closing tons of polling locations in urban cities and in minority neighborhoods is unacceptable because they're Americans too. And I shouldn't be able to vote in 10 minutes while somebody in Atlanta has to stand in line for 8 hours. And that's not some apocryphal story. It actually happened. And we covered it a couple of episodes ago. But for those of you who didn't see it, I think we might have it. And if not, I will bring it up in a minute. The time for silence is over.
So when we got on to the street that lead across the bridge, right on the corner.
Waiting on the other side were Alabama state troopers, under orders from Governor Wallace to stop the marching.
Some of them had on coveralls and jeans, and they was giving us the finger and that type of thing. But for the most part, pretty quiet.
Okay.
And then we got to the top of the bridge. Down below, we saw the steel blue.
Park's posse was on the sideline.
The uniform, and behind the state trooper was the sheriff posse on horseback. And we continued to walk. No one saying a word. And we came within hearing distance of the state troopers. And this major identified himself and said, "I'm Major John Cloud of the Alabama State Troopers. This is an unlawful march and will not be allowed to continue. I give you 3 minutes to disperse and return to your church." And Jose said, "Major, give us a moment to pray. And before we can pass word back for people to kneel and pray," he said, "Troopers, advance." And you saw these men putting on their gas masks. And they came toward us, beating up with nightsticks, bullwhips, trampling us with horses, and releasing the tear gas. I was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick. And,
in the film, it looked like when they hit you first, it was like dominoes.
Right. And people just start trampling over each other. The last thing I remember, I was just out on the ground, and I thought I was going to die. I thought I saw death. And I thought it was the Lions protest. And 41 years later, I don't recall how I made it back across the bridge, back through these streets, back to the church.
"10 days after Selma, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was introduced. It added additional protections, got rid of literacy tests, but it also had a way to prevent any other creative changes.
State governments had to submit their changes to the federal government for approval.
The Voting Rights Act identified parts of the country that had a history of voter discrimination, mostly in the South, and set up federal oversight. So if these places wanted to change anything about voting, like enacting a new law or closing polling locations, it first had to get the okay from the U.S. Justice Department or federal courts that it wasn't discriminatory. Immediately, non-white voter registration in these southern states grew, like in Mississippi, where it went from barely 7% to almost 60% in just 3 years. The Voting Rights Act did what earlier civil rights laws hadn't. When Joseph Johnson went to vote in his first presidential election, this isn't what he expected.
The line went this way in front of our auditorium and then snaked around into our library.
The last person at his polling location didn't get to vote until 1 a.m.
It was the longest line that I've ever waited in my entire life. Some people, they were just like, well, screw it.
The challenge to the law brought the issue all the way to the Supreme Court.
1965 Voting Rights Act. The Justices County
versus Holder.
Shelby versus Holder.
I just get wound up when you ask me about voting rights.
But in 2013, the Supreme Court, with a majority of Republican-appointed judges, took on a case about the Voting Rights Act.
This statute is in part about our march through history to keep promises that our Constitution says for too long were unmet.
The issue is why just in these states?
Justice Scalia, it's a fair question, and I was speaking to the aggregate.
Not just a fair one, it's the crucial question.
They decided that the way the law calculated which states would have that federal oversight was outdated and therefore unconstitutional.
Some states passed voting legislation just hours after the ruling. Alabama implemented new voter ID laws. North Carolina eliminated 7 days of early voting. And the list goes on. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, an independent federal agency, says these are the 5 most common voter suppression tactics. They happen across the country, but the only state that has ticked every box is Georgia.
As Secretary of State, I work to secure our elections and prevent illegal citizens or illegal immigrants from voting in Georgia.
One study showed that in communities where more than 90% of registered voters were minorities, the average minimum wait time at the polls was 51 minutes. When whites made up more than 90% of voters, it was just 6 minutes.
7 hours, 45 minutes, and 13 seconds it took for me to vote in Fulton County, Georgia. As soon as I saw the line, I hit the stopwatch on my phone. I spent the first couple hours listening to new Run the Jewels album, and then I ended up listening to the entire discography. And then I started watching season 8 of Curb Your Enthusiasm. That's 5 hours. It is 1 o'clock in the morning. Somebody was like, "Hey, y'all remember we came to vote yesterday, right?"
Not everyone has to wait. This is a map of all the polling locations in Josephs County that had reports of long lines. And here's the percentage of non-white voters in each area. Notice how most places with lines were in less white areas? The poll closures and the other decisions that led to those lines disproportionately affected people of color. And whether or not that was intentional, those kinds of decisions in places like Texas used to be highly regulated and much less frequent.
As Secretary of State, I work to secure our elections and prevent illegal citizens or illegal immigrants from voting in Georgia.
In 2017, 560,000 voters were purged from Georgia's voter rolls. A report later found that black voters were purged at a higher rate in more than half of Georgia's counties. Here's one impact. The 2017 exact match law prevented 53,000 Georgians from having their registrations accepted. Nearly 70% were black.
Other states enacted voter ID laws too, along with other measures that had been previously stopped, like purging voter rolls and closing polling locations. 1,173 places in total, 750 just in Texas. So in 2019, the House of Representatives did just that, passing a new bill to update the criteria for which states get federal oversight. John Lewis, then a congressman in his 17th term, presided over the vote. But the bill passed almost entirely along party lines. Almost no Republicans voted for it, and nearly every Democrat did. Then the bill moved to the Republican-held Senate, where it isn't going to get a vote. And even if it does pass the Senate, the Trump White House has threatened to veto it, arguing the oversight is unnecessary. But the House, Senate, and White House are all up for grabs in the 2020 election. And this is one of the many areas the two presidential candidates have polar opposite views.
Pass the bill to restore the Voting Rights Act. It's one of the first things I'll do as president if elected.
This needs to be the priority. Let the American people be heard. Now, with all due respect to the late Justice Scalia, who asked why specifically in those states, and that was the problem, it's the same reason the fire department only shows up to homes that are on fire, because that's where the problem is. You notice all the rollbacks to keep people from participating in our democracy. You notice where they happened? It was all the states that had been legislated by the Voting Rights Act. What a coincidence. Hey, if your conservative candidate wins, I'm not going to be happy, odds are. There's a few of them that I probably agree with out there, some conservative positions I hold. But if you've got to cheat to do it, if you've got to rob other American citizens of their most basic right to vote? If you've got a rigged democracy, then just admit you're not a fan of democracy. You just want your way. Just admit that you really don't give a damn about America. You just want Republicans to win. I mean, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, I can point to all the evidence that it's a duck. Seems pretty fair to me to just call it what it is. This has never had anything to do with reducing the less than 0.001% of voter fraud that we experience in this country. And you know how I know that? Because every single business in this country would stay open and continue to function if 0.001% of their inventory was stolen by shoplifting. Walmart wouldn't lock its doors and let all those potential customers out there not come in the store and not shop over 0.0001%. They wouldn't do it. So why are you advocating locking people out of participating in our democracy over those same kinds of rates? The part I am missing is the Voting Rights Act didn't require pre-clearance in areas where there are problems. Now it required pre-clearance in areas that had problems 50 to 60 years ago. That's from the chat. Funny how when the Voting Rights Act was overturned, it was the same areas that magically had problems again. Did you notice the two maps were identical? It was Texas, it was Georgia, it was Louisiana, it was Florida, it was Mississippi 50 to 60 years ago. And then in 2017, it was Georgia, it was Texas, it was Florida, it was Mississippi, it was Alabama. Don't forget that march took place from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama. And don't forget that Supreme Court case came from Shelby, Alabama. Those places never quit burning in a lot of instances. We just had the fire department there making sure it wasn't getting out of control. Scalia had a joke of a point. What is my evidence for the problems there now? You heard me cite a lot of opinions, but no facts to support them. Did you not watch the video? The one that I literally just played? That showed the multiple polling locations, over 1,000 of them, all in the same states that were being previously regulated under the Voting Rights Act? Over 1,100 of them, if memory serves, since it was about 3 minutes ago. Did you not watch the polling or the purging of voter registrations in Georgia? Did you not notice how one change purged over 53,000 Georgian citizens' names? And oh, it's just a coincidence that 70% of them happen to be black. Did you not watch the same video I watched where there's literal video of a man having to stand in line for 8 hours to vote? Quit putting your party before democracy. It is a fact. Okay, let me quote this. It was full of opinion and no evidence. It is a fact that 53,000 names were removed from the voter rolls in Georgia. It is a fact that 70% of them were minority, black to be specific. Those aren't opinions. Those are objective facts. Learn the difference. It is a fact that over 1,000 polling locations were closed in the same states that had previously been regulated by the Voting Rights Amendment. That's a fact, not an opinion. Learn the difference. It is a fact when I look at that county in Texas that the majority of them that had extended lines were in minority neighborhoods. That's not an opinion. That's an objective fact. I'm sorry that the facts don't agree with your opinion that it's not a problem, but those are facts, not opinions. 53,000 people who no longer are alive or live in those districts. Prove it. That's your opinion. You haven't sourced a fact saying that. This is why you and I disagree. And if they're no longer alive, it'd be pretty difficult to figure out. 70% of them are black. I guess black people tend to die a lot faster than white people, apparently. I mean, that's how you justify that? That's amazing. The registrar of voters, I think you mean the Secretary of State of the state of Georgia, already did prove it before the purge. No, they didn't. It was the exact match clause, which basically means that the names have to match exactly what they're expecting. Considering I have two separate signatures, that's a problem as well. I have one that I use for business and one that I use for personal. The business one because I sign my name 10 million times a day. That law also just happens to affect minorities at a much greater rate than it affects white people. No, but by they, I assume you mean black people, since those were the ones that were purged at a 70% rate, do tend to move more often without updating their voter registration information. Prove it. That's an opinion. Do I have multiple, noting about signatures, that's a BS point. Do I have multiple spellings of my name on legal documents? It depends. If you're talking about my signature, absolutely. One is signed Chris and my last name, and then when I'm at work in a professional capacity, it is purely my initials. So yes, I do have two separate legal signatures with two separate spellings. My bank will actually accept either one of them, but there is one that is on my driver's license and one that is on my professional license for work. So it's not a BS point. It's an entirely valid point. And considering that my prior line of work required multiple banks to cash my contracts that I had signed, and they all cashed them, I received money for that. It is perfectly valid. You know, with a contract and all that I used to sign, up to 20, 30 a day of being a contract, which is by definition a legal document. So not a BS point. Sorry. exact match on registration purge was spelling of names that had nothing to do with signatures, so you're hand-waving an invalid argument. Signatures had nothing to do with Georgia voter roll purge. I actually agree, but it also proves that you started defending this point before you had any idea what you were talking about, because I mentioned signatures and you just jumped right on it. Which goes to prove my point, that you really don't give a damn as long as your side wins. If it benefits your team, you're in favor. You're trying to convince me to address voter fraud as if it's a problem, and I do not accept the premise that it is a problem, when every source that I search shows that it occurs at a less than 0.0009, the high number that I can find, % chance. I'm more likely to have the guy I'm walking next to be struck by lightning than I am for him to commit voter fraud. So in my opinion, you're saying we should build lightning rods all over the country to protect the integrity of our elections. And that's a pretty hard argument for you to make. And then when I look at the results of your proposed measures to address this non-problem, I see 70% of it affecting black people and not white people. And I see you hand wave it away because black people move more. I see ridiculously long lines in primarily minority neighborhoods. And you just hand wave it away because that's the way that it is. I see claims of election voter fraud by mail, and I see the same evidence level that I see for alien abductions. So yes, at a baseline level, I do not accept that voter fraud is a problem right now in this country. And I see a whole lot of policies that are being enacted by Republicans that seem to have a completely different impact. That seem to discourage people, groups of people who typically don't support Republican Party, from voting, or to make it more difficult for them to vote. Attack the person. Oh, attack the person, ignore the facts. I just spouted off a whole bunch of facts to you, brother. But nice try. My point was, it's an illustration of the fact that you're assuming a defense of a position that you haven't researched, because it's not about evidence for you. Nice deflection. I see that you failed to admit your argument on voter roll purge, that you have multiple signatures, was completely invalid. No, my baseline argument was that it affects black people disproportionately compared to white people. I threw in the part about signatures to see if you had any actual research on it. I see that you Google quickly. But had you actually known the facts, instead of assuming the defense because it was, something Republicans support, then I knew you'd jump all over it, and you did. I left a big old wide juicy trap for you, and you just barreled straight through it, brother. That's what happened. Why do you think when you finally brought it up after about 5 to 10 comments, I immediately acknowledged it? Go back and rewind. Check again. I spouted off opinions, not facts. Again, you need to learn the difference. It is a fact that 1,100 polling locations were closed after the Supreme Court case. That's not an opinion. It is an objective, verifiable fact. It is a fact that the exact match registration law that was passed in the state of Georgia affected 53,000 voters and 70% of them were black. That's not an opinion. That's a fact. So you can keep spouting that this is my opinion, but those are objective facts. give you proof that there was any malicious intent. I don't need to prove malicious intent to say that the problem needs to be fixed. If your house is on fire, I do not need to prove arson to bring the fire department to put out the house. The intent is irrelevant. I can look at the results of the policies. Maybe they had good intent. Maybe they really thought there was a problem. That doesn't mean that it's a policy worth continuing when I can look at the results, and it's disproportionately affecting minorities. And it just happens to be in the same states that have had this problem of disproportionately affecting minorities before. But the facts don't show us any. Show you any what? You think having to stand in line for 8 hours to vote is acceptable? If I see smoke, it might be barbecuing. You haven't shown any evidence that there's an actual problem. I agree. Voter fraud is not an actual problem. Please provide proof that it is. If you want me to continue these policies that, as you admit, are producing smoke. And I know there's a delay, so we're going to pause for a minute and see if this gentleman in chat can actually provide any proof of the problem he's claiming he wants to solve. If you want me to keep your solutions to a problem that wasn't a problem back then and isn't a problem today based off all the evidence I'm seeing, please provide proof of voter fraud. We're all waiting. We're waiting on your proof of voter fraud so we can keep your solutions to this supposed problem. I am claiming that voter roll purge is a problem. Please provide proof. I already showed you proof. 53,000 were expunged and 70% of them happened to be black. Your response to that was, without any evidence, your opinion that black people happen to move more. You're claiming that I should have this exact registration match law because voter fraud is a problem. I do not accept your premise that voter fraud is a problem. For the last time, please provide your evidence that voter fraud is a problem. Can you do that? I still haven't shown that any of those 53,000 people still live there or that there was any harm. Please, for the last time, this is your last chance. Please provide evidence that voter fraud is a problem that we need to address. And by the way, the harm is the 8-hour line. Which was also in the video that you didn't pay much attention to, apparently. But I am waiting on your evidence, not opinion, facts, not opinion, that voter fraud is a problem. Okay, at this point, I'm going to assume that you cannot provide evidence that voter fraud is a problem. You have repeatedly ducked the question. Can you or can you not? The final response from this gentleman was that I'm getting ridiculous because I'm demanding evidence that voter fraud is a problem, something that he is supporting policies supposedly addressing. He's all in favor of these policies that have obviously much larger impacts on minorities, as demonstrated factually with evidence, than they do on white people, in states that previously had a problem with letting black people vote. These laws were reenacted to prevent voter fraud, and when asked multiple times to present evidence that voter fraud is actually an issue, the answer is, I'm getting ridiculous because I'm asking for evidence of the problem that these policies are supposed to address. That was the conservative answer to this. This is why I don't believe you. This is why I think the policies have other problems or have other intents. Because when repeatedly asked for the evidence of voter fraud, you know, the justification that was used to enact all of these policies, you flat out refuse to answer the question. You flat out pretend like I don't ask the question. And you flat out try to have the next argument. We're still on argument number 1. You need to prove voter fraud. If you want me to consider any answers to voter fraud, whether it's exact match registration, whether it's closing polling locations, whether it's reducing early voting, those are all the next argument. We're still on the first argument, prove voter fraud. Because until you can show me that this is a problem beyond the odds of getting struck by lightning, then I don't care about all your other solutions to this problem, because it's not a problem. If I came to you and said Donald Trump lost the election because all of his voters happened to get struck by lightning on the way to the polls, so we need to put up lightning rods everywhere so that this doesn't happen again, you don't get to start having an argument with me about whether or not removing lightning rods will help the situation. I need to prove that lightning rods are necessary in the first place. I'm not interested in having the next argument with you until you can prove that voting fraud is a problem in this country. And I guess that's it, folks. It's the best he's got. Can't prove voter fraud, but we want to argue about all the individual policies we've put into place. And I have to show their negative impacts which we already did. But I have to show their negative impacts to his satisfaction when he has refused to present any evidence whatsoever of voter fraud. You know, the things these policies were actually supposed to address. That's why I'm no longer a conservative. Your only argument with me was my claim regarding that the Supreme Court decision on Shelby versus Holder was wrong. But nice attempt to argue my refutation of your argument on the basis that I won't argue with you about a completely different topic. Okay, so if Shelby versus Holder was removed and the same states that had been held under the Voting Rights Amendment to a higher standard because they weren't trusted to not disproportionately impact minorities again, the minute it was removed, as we saw in the video, started enacting all these laws to reduce the number of voters or reduce the number of people on the voter rolls, and you can't show me voter fraud, which was the justification that they used, then yes, it's a problem. I'm not having a completely different argument with you. I'm not letting you skip the first step and have the next argument. I'm sorry that's inconvenient to you, but you need to prove your case. And you start with step one. If the justification used for all of these policies was voter fraud, please provide the evidence of voter fraud. I can't show you that the removal caused any harm. Again, go back and watch the video. 70% of the names removed from that one policy alone were minority and black. Did you not watch the video where voter registration in those states used to be in the single digits? And then with the Voting Rights Amendment, voter registration of minorities increased up to 60 and 70%? Did you not watch the video where it showed that most of the polling locations that had excessively long lines just happened to be in minority communities in the state of Texas and that county? If you want to keep any of these policies that were enacted to, curb voter fraud, then prove that voter fraud is a problem. I can claim harm, but I can't prove harm. You can claim voter fraud, but you can't prove voter fraud. And I can show 8-hour lines and people standing in them. I showed video evidence of these ridiculously long lines around the block. I showed the purge rates and how they're 70% black from one policy in the state of Georgia. And I showed all the states that it happened in. If you don't want to believe your eyes because your party tells you differently, if you don't want to believe your ears because your party tells you differently, that's your problem, not mine. And again, I still want evidence to justify those policies in the first place. I showed no evidence that the voter roll purge negatively impacted anybody. I showed evidence that it impacted 70% black people and 30% white people, and that's mighty convenient for a state with a history of, disenfranchising black people. However, the voter roll purge, as we heard the Georgia Secretary of State and current Georgia governor say, was put into place to reduce illegal voter fraud. Please provide illegal voter fraud evidence. I won't even limit you to the state of Georgia. That's how generous I am. Can you prove your case to justify the policy or not? I would think that's a very simple question. Are there dead people still on the voter rolls? Yes. Are there people who no longer live on the voter rolls? Yes. That's all the evidence you need to support voting or purging voter rolls. I'm asking why the new purging of voting registrations, like the exact match law in the state of Georgia, which is an example of one of those policies. The justification given for that example was voter fraud. Yes, I'm aware people die, and yes, I'm aware people move. I'm not aware of evidence that says that, white people die at half the rate of black people in the state of Georgia. And again, if the justification for, further reducing active voter registrations, that was given by the man who wrote and recommended the law, was voter fraud, please provide evidence of voter fraud. If you're answering any other question, then show me your evidence of voter fraud. You're not answering the question I'm asking you. This is a simple question. Can I see your evidence of voter fraud? The burden of proof is on me to show harm. I'm asking you to justify the law in the first place. Again, you're trying to have the next argument. I'm still stuck on the first one. Show me the evidence of voter fraud, because voter fraud was what was used to justify this policy, this new policy that was passed after Shelby v. Holder. So yes, the burden of proof is on the person claiming that there is voter fraud. You don't care about the question I'm asking. You are here to show the flaws in my argument. You're not showing any flaws in my argument. You're trying to have the next argument. I'm saying the justification for all of these laws in the first place was flawed because there was no evidence that the burden of proof for those claims that led to these policies does not exist, and therefore they should all be removed. Now, if you don't care about my questions, then we're not having a conversation, so I'm just going to quit replying to you. It's that simple and straightforward. A conversation requires a back and forth. And if you can't do that, if you want to dishonestly represent my position by ignoring any questions I ask you, then I'm not interested in having a conversation with you. So I'm going to take a break. I will give you a chance to go find and meet the burden of proof for voter fraud, which is what led to all of these policies that I'm objecting to currently. I'm saying the burden of proof was never met in the first place to justify all of them. And then when I come back from the break, we'll see if you can answer that question or not. If you can't, then I'll just move on. We'll be back after the break, folks. Thank you. And welcome back. We'll be wrapping up shortly here. So if anybody would like to call in, feel free. The response was, I see how your show works. It's only a conversation on the question you want to discuss. Move on. No, a conversation is by definition a back and forth between two people. If you want to address any question that I ask because it's inconvenient for you, then it's not a conversation. It's that simple. So yes, we can no longer have a conversation on this topic because you will not have a conversation with me. I have asked the same question multiple times and have not gotten an answer of any variety. Now, to go to the most basic point, and to try and illustrate where I'm coming from. If somebody's convicted of murder and we put them in jail, I don't have to show the harm that being in jail has done to this person to remove them from jail. If there was not sufficient evidence to justify putting him in jail in the first place. This is why I keep saying you're trying to have the next argument. I'm saying it was wrong to enact the policy in the first place. Straightforward. But to get off of that topic, since we're apparently unable to have a conversation because no questions are answered, that, in my opinion, is priority number one for the new Democratic administration. Whether it will be accomplished or not remains yet to be seen. But I think that all American citizens have the right to participate in democracy. Because as the Declaration of Independence says, the right to govern comes from the consent of the governed. And if you remove their right to consent, then you no longer have that right to govern. Priority number two for me, and unfortunately we're not going to have a whole lot of time to dive into this because we're wrapping up here very shortly, but we'll start to address it in the next show so you can get a head start, is reinstatement of the fairness doctrine and its expansion to internet media, which serves as news for a lot of people nowadays. For those of you who are unaware, the fairness doctrine is what used to say and be enforced that the news had to produce actual, factual, evidence-based news. You couldn't just get on and run commentary. I think requiring evidence and requiring honest representation in news media is a good thing. And I think that's led to a lot of our problems today. As we saw from Project Veritas at the beginning of the show, none of that was evidence. It was all claims. It was all interviews with anonymous people or an anonymous person claiming to have seen voter fraud, but providing no proof of it. There was no balance showing the historical rate of voter fraud as researched by multiple institutions at less than 1%. And quite obviously, there are a lot of members of this society who have a problem producing evidence for their claims and want to make policies based off of those claims without providing the evidence to justify them in the first place. I don't get to enact policies, whether it's purging voter rolls or locking someone in jail, until I provide sufficient evidence to justify those policies. Our commenter made a comment that has absolutely nothing to do with my question. So until we can have a conversation and you can address my question, I'm not addressing you anymore. I'm sorry. You're making that decision, not me. I've read all of your statements thus far. You have yet to answer my one question. I'm not even saying we have to stay specifically on that question. But it's not a conversation if you won't respond to anything I ask. So we're done on this topic. Until you can provide evidence of voter fraud or admit that there isn't any, then we're done on this topic. It's that simple. If you can admit there's none, or if you can provide evidence, then we can address that point, and we can dive into any other points you might like to raise. But it's going to be a back and forth conversation, or it's not going to happen. It's that simple. I find, to go back to the fairness doctrine, that the news inform the American public a hell of a lot better back when it was in effect than it does now. Back when we were all relying on evidence instead of supporting blind statements that have no more evidence than alien abductions. And I think that would be a huge step in the right direction for this country. So my show is only open to people who are willing to answer your one question. No, my show is open to anybody willing to have a conversation. I'm sorry you're incapable of that. And to address the only one question, I even said once you can answer my one question or concede a point and move on, then we can dive into other questions you may have. It's a back and forth. It's a conversation. This isn't your platform where you get to get up and say whatever you want unquestioned. This isn't a platform where you get to ignore my questions. I haven't ignored a single one of yours. I've addressed them all. And the last thing I will say before wrapping up this show is the one thing this election taught us beyond any shadow of a doubt is that there is a very real message. I personally think it's a very dangerous message, but there is a very real resonance in this country with Trump's message. This was not a landslide blowout victory. Even with saying that the problem with elections is the ballots, even with claiming voter fraud and trying to stop counting ballots, even with undermining the basics of American democracy, this was not a blowout. So those of us who believe in democracy, believe that votes should be counted, rely on evidence to support our claims, ask for evidence repeatedly even when it's denied to us, we have to be vigilant. You cannot get complacent and not vote. Georgia is going to have runoff elections coming up soon. Those of you in Georgia, make sure to get back out to those 8-hour poll lines and vote again. Make your voice heard. It's important. And do not let these policies, these unjustified policies, because no one, when asked repeatedly to show evidence of voter fraud, has been able to do so. Do not let these policies take away your voice. Vote. One person who votes is heard more than 10,000 who do not. If you don't vote, you're not heard. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in today. We'll see you next week.